This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. For the next few weeks and months, I have a series I did in collaboration with Scott Rank of the History Unplugged podcast. In this series, we take some of the history-based movies we love and we hate the most and put them on trial, so to speak. We explain why we either loved it or hated the movie, and then the other person has to try and prove them wrong. It's just a great time because if you're anything like me, you have very strong opinions on history-based movies. We will talk about a wide range of movies from different historical periods. Our first History Hates Hollywood is the 2009 movie Agora. Agora is from 2009, and it's about the situation of Hypatia of Alexandria and the Christians in about the 5th century AD. If you want to hear a very detailed background and description in the movie, you can just re-listen to the last episode on your feed that I did with Jonathan of the History of the Cops podcast. During that podcast, in my host role, I held back my opinions of the movie as best I could, and I had rather strong opinions on it. In the episode with Scott Rank, I'll just let you know what I really think about the movie. Now, if you have a historical movie you love or you hate, let me know, and maybe we can make an episode of it for History Hates Hollywood. And definitely tune into Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast, which I included in the show notes. Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen, and I hope to see you next time on Beyond the Big Screen and History Hates Hollywood.
All right, everyone, welcome back to our series on the most historically inaccurate movies. Steve, are you ready to channel all your hatred and anger into your movie of choice?
Oh, I've been ready for a long time.
Yeah, this is going to be tricky because the way we do this, I'm a defender, but I don't know. It's sort of like defender in the devil's advocate sense. I guess it's kind of like a lawyer for the Nuremberg trials. I don't know if that's too strong of an analogy, but hey, legally, I am required to present my client, even though they're a mass murderer. So, I'm going to do the best I can. I'll try to imagine what someone who does like this movie and think it's right would say. Here I stand. I could do no other. God help me. All right. So our movie we're going to look at is Agora, that came out in 2009. Director Alejandro Amenabar. Did I say that right?
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
All right. So this is about the historical figure, Hypatia, and the cast is pretty cool. Rachel Weisz, all right, good. And then Oscar Isaac, which, he was in a lot of stuff before he had his breakout with, I guess, Poe Dameron and some other stuff. But I saw him in Drive. He's been in a lot of random roles, and here he is in this one too. So, that's what we're going to be looking at. And Steve, I guess you should give the overview before we really get into it and talk about what it does terribly, what it, I think could arguably do some things well and everything in between. So take it away.
I guess the broad overview of the movie, historically speaking, at least what the film is trying to capture is the situation in Alexandria, Egypt in late 300s, early 400s, what you might call late antiquity. It's right before the fall of Rome. So obviously all throughout the Roman Empire, things are very unstable. This particular film focuses in on Hypatia, who was a woman, Neoplatonic philosopher. She works out of this famous, almost what you might call university called the Serapeon, which was associated somewhat with the classical Library of Alexandria. Things had changed a lot with the Library of Alexandria, which is something to keep in mind that we'll talk about later. There was a lot of, like I was saying, complications, political complications that were going on in Egypt. Egypt was really separated from a lot of the problems that the rest of the Roman Empire was having with the Huns and all the invading Germanic groups. They really didn't have that. Also in this context, there was a history, which is very important to this film, is the history of Christianity at that time. There was a lot of controversy at this point over the nature of Jesus's human and divine aspects, and the movie doesn't get into this, but they get into big time. One of the big, you said Rachel Weisz as Hypatia, and Oscar Isaac played the high-ranking Byzantine official. Well, it wasn't quite Byzantine yet. Eastern Roman official Orestes. There was also a relatively unknown to American or English-speaking audiences, who played Cyril of Alexandria, who was the big bishop of Alexandria, and he was probably, arguably, the most powerful bishop in Christianity, period, at that time. Really, if you sit in a pew today as a Christian, you can probably say about 80% of the theology that you hear today came from Cyril of Alexandria. That's how important he was. And now I could go into a lot more of this. In fact, if you listen to my podcast Beyond the Big Screen, I did a whole episode on just the historical nature of this movie that was about 2 hours long. So if you really want to do a deep dive on the history, go back and listen to that episode. But where the movie ties in is that they show Hypatia as a young woman, Rachel Weisz, who has a huge cast of characters of high-ranking nobles and thinkers who are her students in this Neoplatonic school that she runs. Neoplatonism was obviously tied in with the ideas of Plato, which at this point, Neoplatonism was really heavily, it influenced Christianity, but Christianity also influenced Platonism. Platonism here is sort of representing paganism, which I think that in this point, a Neoplatonic philosopher would not have thought of themselves as a classic, like, Jupiter worshipping pagan. Just to get down to brass tacks, this movie is a vehicle 100% for the personal views of the producer and director Alejandro Amenabar. He is a pretty atheist guy who was really, if you watch this movie, it feels like it's Galileo versus the heliocentric view of the Earth revolving around the sun.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with what was going on in a really specific time period of late antiquity in Egypt. I don't know why he picked that particular point in time. I think it's because you could have Rachel Weisz in there. But other than that, there's no reason for him to pick the setting of late antiquity Egypt, because he just didn't use that at all, except as a cudgel to bash Cyril of Alexandria.
Yeah, it's, I mean, that's the definite vibe too, where if you asked Hypatia what she believed, it would probably be something similar to monotheism, I guess, as a Neoplatonist, that there's some abstract idea of a god as a prime mover. But it's always, I mean, this is just, I think ahistorical stuff is always, okay, I see myself and my ilk as the good guys. And so I'm going to essentially project myself into the past. And this is the exact beating I gave Kingdom of Heaven, the Crusader movie, where Orlando Bloom is a socially conscientious metropolitan young man from the 21st century Brooklyn who wants interreligious harmony in the Crusades. No, like,
yes.
And like Hypatia, if you actually hung out with her, I don't think, I mean, what's a story where to prove that like there was a story of unrequited love, and she gave him a menstrual lag and said, "This is who I am," showing that she is pure matter and substance, and this is something that has to be transcended. So the point I'm getting at is that she would have some ideas that would be a little bit off-putting, so don't completely hitch your cart to her horse. But anyway, go on.
Also with this movie, Hypatia, as we keep saying, is she was a philosopher, and she was probably, I mean, very arguably the top philosopher of that age, and in many ways one of the top philosophers of all times. But she was a philosopher, period. there's no, in this movie, she goes from being an late antiquity Neoplatonic philosopher to an astrophysicist.
She's going to discover heliocentrism right there.
When it was a big stretch that the Earth was round. That wasn't a big stretch at the time that the Earth was round, but that the fact that not everything revolved around the Earth, and that the Earth was, these were all just such enormous concepts that they would have had no clue about thinking about it. I don't think that there was even a hint of that the Earth and that the sun revolved around the Earth, I think, until Islamic times, a couple of hundred years later, and it really wasn't completely fleshed out until Copernicus over 1,000 years later. So the idea that Hypatia, sitting in her yard playing around with some instruments, figures out that the Earth revolves around the sun is just preposterous.
Yeah, I think, okay, this is something, there's a lot to untangle here, but maybe one point you can get on that probably ties into the whole, the Library of Alexandria was burnt down. And something I think about this is Carl Sagan has mentioned this, and there was an episode of Family Guy where Brian and Stewie go to a parallel universe where Christianity never existed, and it's ahead 1,000 years technologically. And the idea is probably, well, Christians burned down the Library of Alexandria like this, and there's just, I don't know, we'd have advanced calculus in 800, and then we'd be going to the moon in 1,000, whatever. I mean, so that seems to be the idea that's really taken hold and been repeated by tons of people. So I don't know if the narrative about Library of Alexander is a good time to go into it, but that's a big part of this movie.
And I think I'll lay it out where I stand on historical movies, and I've said it in the past, and I'm sure I'll say it again. I am not one to sit there with a pen and paper and, this is inaccurate and this is inaccurate. I really like to look at the movie as getting the gist of what a time period is. If I watch a movie, do I feel something about a time period? And if they get a couple of facts wrong, or if they massage some facts and some people and times, but I'm still feeling that the producer and the director have captured an era, that to me is the mark of a great historical film. This just doesn't get to any of that. It's just window dressing for ideas that the author probably could have written a nonfiction book about what he really thought. And then he could have skipped the middleman of a story where you come in and you're expecting something particular and something interesting, and then they just don't deliver anything of what you thought it would be.
So I guess, I don't know if, can you give an overview, like, first of all, what happens historically? So Hypatia, she's teaching in Alexandria. What causes her to get killed, and what's going on with all that?
The very, very short story is there's a gigantic battle between Constantinople, which is the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the leadership in Egypt, which is still a part of the Eastern Roman Empire. Throughout the 300s, the Christian church started taking over more functions of secular government in Egypt. Constantinople didn't exactly love that. So there was a lot of conflict between the Christian church that was kind of running the show in Egypt and the secular power in Constantinople. There was religious strife as well. On top of that, inside of Egypt, there was a lot of conflict between Jews and Christians. Constantinople would kind of pick sides with one group to play against the other as a classic Byzantine political play. But and going back in history, Alexandria in particular was always a place that would go into riot over just about anything. Now, what gets Hypatia into trouble is she takes the side of the governor, Orestes, who was put in place by Constantinople. she was viewed by the Christians as somebody who was tied in with the what they perceived as the group from the outside who was oppressing them. There was a gigantic blowout uprising. She got caught up in the middle of it, and there's some argument she was either killed in the street or killed in the main church of Alexandria. One way or the other, she was basically lynched in the street as what the movie portrays her as a 30 or 40 something Rachel Weisz. She was probably well into her 70s at that point.
So it'd be Helen Mirren playing the role instead of Rachel Weisz. Not going to complain about looking at Rachel Weisz for the movie instead of Helen Mirren, but, that's just, a little side factually.
And it's something that's jarring in the movie as well, because they do show it starting much earlier, about 20 years before. She looks the same as she does 20 to 30 years later, where they put Oscar Isaac gets a little, classic gray put into his hair to make him look a little bit older. The other actors they try to make a little bit older. She looks exactly the same. But in the end, she's not killed in the same way that the movie portrays it, or not exactly. And it wasn't exactly on the orders of Cyril. I'm sure Cyril wasn't terribly upset by her being murdered in the street, but it was not a hit put out against her, because she was the paragon of paganism and she was going to spin things around against Christianity. That wasn't quite how it worked.
I mean, to be fair, you might see some more stuff like that in later centuries, like the 6th century, when Justinian expels the philosophers of the school of Athens. They go over to Persia. But yeah, this is just a whole different thing when Christianity is still becoming an imperial religion, and it's not maybe quite rooting out paganism the same way. But yeah, there was a ecclesial history I found where I think it's Socrates Scholasticus. He says something about that people all throughout the city admired her dignity and virtue and teaching ability and all these different things. But yeah, I guess that's just a story that it would be hard to portray in film. Of who would really care about, hey, there was a riot over politics. I mean, then you're basically getting into Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, like boring political speeches in a fight that doesn't make any sense. So
yeah, exactly. The story that they tell, they try to add in some little bits and pieces, like the Christian mob attacked the Serapion and went in there and burned books. Then that's like the last destruction of the Library of Alexandria. But from what I understand, the Library of Alexandria was not what it was in late before the BCE times. It had been destroyed, I think, or in large part of it had burned during Julius Caesar. Part of it burned a little bit later. There was some destruction of it at this point, and there was even some destruction of it during Islam conquest times a couple of hundred years after this point. So it wasn't like this is where the Library of Alexandria was basically the Library of Congress of the antiquity, and then it gets destroyed, and then we go into the Dark Ages. That's just not how it happened.
Yeah, from what I've heard, at least from Hypatia, that the place in the film that's depicted of being burned, that area may have been a daughter library of the main one at one point, but a lot of the earlier accounts don't even mention books being destroyed. So in the kerfuffle, I'm sure some scrolls were burned, but the early accounts don't mention it. Like you said, the Great Library had undergone various levels of destruction. And one historian I read talked about, well, okay, what was actually lost with its destruction? Now, I'm sure any classicist would give anything to bring it back. I'm sure there's tons of Greek plays and things like that were lost in that. But the analogy they gave, it's sort of like if today the Library of Congress were burned down. Would we lose a lot of precious manuscripts that were unreplaceable? Yes. I mean, that would be a bad thing. But would there actually be any human knowledge that was lost by that? Well, no, because if it were some sort of a lot of knowledge and information or technology, it's not that it was really written down by a book. It might be, this is a functional guild that's supported by an empire, and that's why this technology is still here. So Roman concrete disappears, not because the recipe for it was lost, but the guild or the craftsmen who made it weren't connected to an empire that had enough money that could keep them going, so the knowledge gets lost. But it's not like we would be, orbiting Pluto right now if the Library of Alexandria hadn't been burned down, I think is the idea here.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I think that's the point you get to, is that the Roman Empire had a lot of stagnation going on at that point. There were innovations that they could have followed up on that never were followed up on. I mean, they had batteries that worked in a theoretical sense. They had steam engines that worked in a theoretical sense. They weren't following up on these things. It's not like Hypatia in actuality invented anything. Well, she didn't invent anything because she was a philosopher, not an engineer. Also, it's something that the movie touched on, but never spoke about it directly, was there were a lot of slaves. Hypatia had several slaves throughout the movie that they never addressed this fact that she has slaves. The only thing is that her main slave, Davus the slave, who is a fictional character, he breaks away, and then I think in the end he's the one who ultimately kills her, or is one of the leaders of it. So he breaks away, becomes a Christian, and then basically becomes Torquemada of the Spanish Inquisition. When he was a slave, he had some legitimate gripes against Hypatia.
Yeah, slavery, I can see that. Have we mentioned yet how she's killed in the movie?
Not exactly. It's a pretty gruesome scene where she's stripped and killed on the high altar of the cathedral, the most important cathedral in Alexandria.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's something that I think before this movie came out, there were different histories like Edward Gibbon or Enlightenment histories. That's the main point, and there's plenty of paintings of Hypatia being killed and flayed, so I'm sure pictures of that were found by many 14-year-old boys in libraries throughout the different time periods in history. But so I think that's a story that kind of fits into this Enlightenment narrative of the closing of this early Enlightenment and the kind of how fragile civilization can be. And also notice that it seems like the Christian mobs, they had this sort of like Taliban ISIS look to them as well.
Well, yeah, that was something that they were even criticized by Coptic people, was that they made them out to be just monsters dressed in black, just killing people willy-nilly. It really was. It was reminiscent more of, I mean, even the Spanish Inquisition isn't exactly what popular culture brings it out to be, but it's very much in a very different time frame sense of things that it just didn't exist then. So many of the elements that they bring up in this movie just didn't exist and just weren't relevant to the early 400s.
Well, I guess you're gonna talk about why you hated it, which is it's hard to separate that in its own section because that's been so blended in. I guess I'll try to say a couple positive things because I am the defender, so I'll do my defense in the Nuremberg trial here. Okay, so the design, it does sort of try to mix in elements with like Egyptian elements with Roman and Hellenic, and that's kind of cool because, part of imperial architecture is an imperial architect could design a building from Rome or in Byzantine times from Constantinople or in Ottoman times Istanbul. But in the provinces, you might have the structure plan sent from the center, but then you would do the design and the ornamentation locally. So there's a little mismatch that the movie kind of does. The costumes don't really reflect that because they all have that generic first century Rome look that you see in Gladiator or Passion of the Christ or whatever place in Hollywood where there's all like the storage facility of Rome costumes. It's these generic togas and tunics and stuff like that. And this is a little bit nitpicky, but hey, history nerds here, we'll just go for it. That, I mean, it seems like you're always going to have the same soldier garb. They have the gladius sword. They have the segmented leather for armor. By the 5th century here we're getting into, they're almost starting to look kind of medieval with more metal used. So, but I don't expect, that's probably expecting too much. What else can I say? It's good. I think the movie kind of mentions that they sort of say something that this library was part of the Great Library, so they at least understand that aspect of it. The interpretation gets a little bit silly, where Hypatia rebuffed potential suitors or the prefect because, I mean, for her as a Neoplatonist, that would have been her reasons. In the movie, it's more like she's a career academic married to her job. So the facts would have been right, but then the interpretation is what's silly. So that is my very, very flimsy, flaccid defense of the movie. Anything else I can think of? No.
What I would defend...
Go for it.
In the movie, I would defend that it is visually appealing. It captures an interesting setting. I mean, Egypt in late antiquity is something that isn't very well covered in movies. You don't see that every day. I think it touched upon a lot of interesting ideas that it just never followed up on, like the interactions between Jews and Christians. That was fascinating. The Jews were expelled from Egypt during the reign of Cyril of Alexandria. There's a lot of interesting things that they could have gotten into here. Orestes and how his real relationship was with Hypatia. I mean, you get into it that it just become a political movie, that there's nothing, it's a political potboiler that takes place in 5th century Egypt is not the most exciting movie. But I think they had something to work with there that it was never in the filmmaker's idea to follow through some of the more interesting themes that I think could have been really fun.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's so much to unpack here. So any other things that you think are just, you think, this movie that you really hated?
I hated the fact that they treated the cops. The cops today are a people who have a pretty rough time of it. It's not easy to be a cop in Egypt today. And you're just going to run them through the mud? Like, I mean, what other group would we look at and not try and at least throw them a bone? I don't like how they played lightly with the slavery aspect of it. Like Davos should have been happy to be a slave to Hypatia.
Mm-hmm.
And I just felt like this whole idea of the radical science-hating Christians, and they've had enough with this woman Hypatia, and they kill her right in the middle of the church on the altar. And science loses one of its greatest figures, and then the world's over, and we're in the Dark Ages. Like, that's just it's not accurate, for one, but I think if you're a kid, I doubt many teenagers would watch this movie, but to leave somebody who's maybe just learning about the history of this era with such a bad, inaccurate view of what the time period was, they're going to either go and research more and say, like, none of this is true, or they're going to research it and be completely uninterested in it. This doesn't open the door for further research or further education. The entertainment doesn't lead to education. It was just preachy. It was basically a sermon of Alejandro Amenabar's beliefs on modernity and modernity, including the early modern age of Galileo and Copernicus.
Yeah, it's that thing where this kind of idea of where civilization is knocked down and it's this religion versus science. I mean, that the idea has been around since the Enlightenment. I think it was definitely repopularized by Carl Sagan with his book Cosmos, his TV show in the 80s. And I think he had the idea when he's writing and doing television during the Cold War, when there's a fear of nuclear destruction. And the idea is, well, civilization can be fragile. Look what has happened in the past. Look what happened with Hypatia, the fall of Greece, the fall of Rome. Galileo is another person who, with the controversy, he shook up the cosmological model of the church, so that's why he was persecuted. So we can't return to the same dogmatic understanding. And I think what we've done on our own respective podcasts is definitely not saying that religious figures don't have they've gotten their hands dirty many times, but the delineation between religion and science is a modern one that people just wouldn't have made in the past. Whether you were a pagan, whether you were a Platonist, whether you were a Christian, there just wasn't the mental framework to make that different type of delineation. And yeah, I mean, I think with this, there's definitely a good movie to be made with the story of Hypatia, because she's a fascinating figure, no question about it. She did something that people typically don't do. So she was a universally beloved leading academic in a very intellectual city who was a woman. Few occupied that role. And I think it's always interesting to see people who do something that typically isn't done by people like them. There's good stories, but it's a completely separate story where he's shoehorning in with religion and science. So yeah. So something we're trying to do on this series is talk about how would you fix this? What would it take to make this a good movie? So Steve, how would you make this a good movie?
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I think the first thing that I would change is really a different view on Cyril of Alexandria. Now, he's one of those people like you were talking about. He was not a lovey-dovey pastor type. This guy was a political animal who almost certainly did have people commit violence to get what he wanted, but the reasons why he did that are really complicated. And to see somebody like Cyril Alexandria painted in 360 degrees would have been made this movie a lot more interesting. And I think they could have done that and still made him the antagonist of the movie. At least make him somewhat sympathetic, given that there were some reasons why he did the things he did. He wasn't just like a purely evil, literally a man in black. I mean, he wore black the whole movie. I think the other thing they could have done was just focus in more, make it a movie that's about this really great setting of Alexandria and this great story of Hypatia. Maybe instead of the Edward Gibbon, which all the baggage that Edward Gibbon came with, especially as far as Christianity goes, he did not like Christianity, and he in particular did not like the brand of Christianity of like Roman Catholicism, the more ancient versions of the religion. He did not like them. Get away from that narrative and show us something familiar with him, using him and that whole the Gibbons narrative, but give us something new too.
Yeah, it's something that's been rehashed so many times. So to make it three-dimensional, there's a lot of ways you could take, where in the 4th century, with the growth of Christianity, with the decline of paganism, and not just the religious fracture, but also the power. Constantinople has its Byzantine administrator there in the city who's a leader, but then bishops are taking more and more secular power. I mean, there's almost Shakespearean overtones there you could have there of a clash between two titanic, just a power struggle between two. Or so there's so many ways that you can take it and make it interesting, but it's a silly kind of message movie shoved in what could be a good story. It's like the criticism that our most recent Academy Award winner Green Book got, where you have an interesting story of this jazz musician, but then it's this very silly message movie of, wow, guys, racism is bad. So, and then this becomes like the same silly message movie. Guys, we shouldn't kill scientists. Okay, I agree. Yeah. We shouldn't kill scientists. Oh, all right. So like, yeah, it's just a wasted opportunity. Fascinating historical figures, very interesting time period for a very silly message movie.
Yeah, that's the thing to me that honestly it makes this one of my least favorite movies of all time is that it missed on every single point that it could have done something interesting, and it just fell flat on every single one of them. Now people may disagree with that, and I think that's where the audience, you can come in. Where am I wrong? And maybe where should I look at this movie and have a different perspective on it? Prove me wrong, as they say nowadays. Prove to me that this wasn't actually a great movie.
Yeah, leave your feedback, and also, I guess if you're a glutton for punishment, or if you like to hate watch movies, or I like to think that for movies, there's something fascinatingly instructive by seeing what people did wrong that's almost as teachable as seeing people who execute things well. I was a bad movie aficionado growing up. I think I saw Cool as Ice, the Vanilla Ice movie on cable one time, and I just fell in love with it because every wrong choice you can make with a movie they did, and loved Mystery Science Theater 3000, where they make fun of a movie, but there's a passionate love where they see the heart and soul that went into these terrible B movies and the bold decisions that the filmmakers made. Now, every decision was the wrong decision. So that's what I think makes a good bad movie. But then there's the bad movie, which I think I would dub Hypatia, where it's not a fiasco. I respect a fiasco. It's it boldly goes for it and boldly, triumphantly, courageously fails. This was just seemed like it had all the right setup. It had a production budget. There was a lot of talent that went into the film, obviously. Oscar winner, I think Oscar Isaac and Rachel Weisz are both Oscar winners. Just with a boring message movie. So, meh. Just
very meh.
Run of the mill failure.
Yes.
All right. Well, I'm proud to say that for the next episode, we're going to do something that I think is anything but meh, because the movie is based off of a writer who has very grandiose ambitions. And I also think he is one of the greatest war criminals of the English language in history. I am speaking about Dan Brown. We are going to go to Rome, going to go to Florence. We're going to go to Istanbul when we talk about Dan Brown's film version, or the film version of Dan Brown's Angels and Demons.